I would love to welcome all of you here. My name is Stephanie Arnott. I'm an associate professor from the University of Ottawa, here to facilitate this session alongside my colleague, Dr. Micah Vannica from the University of British Columbia. I am joining you via my phone, so it's difficult for me to see whether Micah is sharing his screen as of yet, but I know that, there we go. That's excellent. We wanted to first remind you that we're basing this upon findings from the CASLT FSL Teacher Education Project, a pan-Canadian study performed over the course of 2020 to 2023. And it really is a lovely, we feel, extension to this project in terms of treating each of the gaps that we found individually and getting a sense of what provocative questions we as researchers should be asking and different ways of thinking about these particular gaps as a nice extension. So this is a first step in that journey. I wanted to tell you that basically it's going to be a little bit of a double format. So I'm gonna mention the first gap first, then we're going to move to our featured speaker. Mike is going to introduce Dr. Wendy Carr, and then we're gonna chat with Wendy for a bit about some different questions that we've brought up related to this gap in particular. And we really love you to bring your ears, your eyes, your hearts, listening to the conversation itself, and then offer some questions in the chat to start. Again, in the format of questions, trying to think of what questions we can use to push these issues even further related to the topics that we're going to talk to Wendy about. And then we will try and engage in a bit of a group discussion via the chat and anybody who would like to offer their comments à l'oral. Et c'est juste une question aussi que c'est une session bilingue. Alors, vos commentaires sont accueillis dans la langue de votre choix. It was just to give you a sense, I think somebody put in the chat the link to the final report and the executive report. So the first gap that we're looking at is really the first gap related to this deficit versus development standpoint related to teacher competence. So our findings did show a pervasive focus on what FSL teachers cannot do at every stage of their preparation. So not uniquely in the initial teacher education, but also prior to that and moving through to when they transfer to the field itself. All of our participant groups essentially positioned French language proficiency and second language teaching pedagogical knowledge and skills as something FSL teachers commonly lack before, during, and after their preparation. So this is really what we want to dive into and try and figure out what questions we can ask relative to this gap. So we'll move now to the exchange portion of our time. And I want to, before we introduce our featured speaker, really preface and ground us in what do we mean by exchange? So this part focuses on this idea of listening, obviously, to an exchange of other people. So in this case, myself and our featured presenter, while also saving and parking questions and exchanging later to build on and push our thinking even further. That's really what we're looking for. It's a chance for you to voice a question, a thought, a reflection you may have been asking yourself for a long time, or perhaps that just came to mind in terms of your own experience to date. So I hope that's relatively clear. And right now, I guess I will transfer it over to Micah to introduce Wendy. Thanks, Micah. Merci.
Hello, everyone. Bonjour. I am going to take 2 short minutes to introduce Dr. Wendy Carr, a dear colleague and mentor of mine and professor of teaching emeritus now in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at UBC, at least part-time. I think one of the words that comes to mind when I think of Wendy is advocacy. And this is for French, for teachers, and for youth, for our students, especially when it comes to their well-being, and whether that involves learning and teaching French as a second language in our English-dominant, very multilingual context here on the West Coast, for example, but of course also right across Canada. Whether it's about gender identity, sexual orientation, or mental health literacy, which is very much a current focus for Wendy. And as a former FSL student, then teacher, the teacher educator, a director, and associate dean of teacher education, and her various roles with CASLT and currently Canadian Parents for French, among other associations, organizations, Wendy not only brings an extensive background of knowledge, practice, and also administrative expertise in FSL education, but she carries and shares that knowledge that inspires her advocacy in such thoughtful ways. And I think that's not always easy to do. And she certainly pushes the boundaries of our thinking and has for a long time. And that is why we're actually really, really excited to begin this series with her today. So welcome, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Micah. Stephanie, did you want to start with a question, or may I just
I would love to start with a question and then I will launch you. This is excellent.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
so Mike is going to paste in the chat right now the question that I'm about to ask Wendy. So again, this is, you're not obliged, to those of you in attendance, to post something right away. It's just to sort of give us a way to organize our integration of any questions you may have while Wendy and I are chatting. The first question itself, and I have it here in English. This is, again, the nuances of maneuvering with a phone. Let's go chat. The first question I have for you, Wendy, is how are you thinking about this gap? So the gap is the first gap related to deficit development. Just give us a sense of where your thinking is right now. Comment pensez-vous à cette lacune? Dites-nous où en est votre réflexion en ce moment.
Okay. Well, just before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm actually an uninvited visitor on the territory of the Agua Caliente band of Cahuilla Indians in the Coachella Valley, where Palm Springs is located. So I'm not in my home territory, and I'm very interested in the way languages are being revitalized here. Cahuilla, I've learned, is actually a highly endangered language. And I've been intrigued by some of the parallels between the way language is being revitalized here, drawing on the wisdom of a few remaining elders who speak the language, and the similar efforts in my home province of British Columbia, where half of Canada's Indigenous languages are spoken. Excuse me, not sure what's going on here, just a minute. And I see faces of dear colleagues and friends on this call that I just have to say hello. It's so wonderful to see you again. Callie, I don't even recognize you anymore. Sharon, I see quite often, so that's lovely. Leo, James, I can't see you there, but I see your name. Anyway, and others with whom I've worked. There you are. Hello. Bonjour. And welcome. And Cam, we did a paper together. It's just lovely to see some dear friends on the call today. So this topic, wow. I'm just so delighted. I was, in reading this excellent report, my goodness, and I'm glad we're just talking about one gap, because there's so much to talk about in this. I found some aspects surprising, hopeful, and some really disheartening. One can become very cynical over many years of seeing chronic problems perpetuated and not seeming to get much better. And I've been doing this work for 45 years as an educator. I now consider myself stopped, but and in that time working in K-12 and working at the university level, to see some really chronic problems just go on and on and on. But I do see some fresh takes in this report, and some fresh takes among some of you on the call that I know are doing this important work of teacher education, and that gives me great hope. And I think the first one, to answer your question, Stephanie, is finally a focus on retention. For so long, it's been about filling this bucket with a hole in it. And if we could just get more teachers from out there, we'll solve the chronic problems that we have within French teaching. And I'm happy to see that now finally the attention is turning to retention. I'm also I'm proud of some of the work that I was able to do in teacher education taking hold. And I think one of those is, for example, replacing a high stakes in-house language competency exam with the DELF in order to enter the French specialization program. I think that was embedded in that were many, many conceptualizations of language learning and career-long language development that I think are really healthy. And that is that, you know, it may take several times to sit a DELF or DELF. You may find gaps in certain areas, whereas you have strengths in others, and that can inform, say, a portfolio approach to language development. So that's one sort of event that I think, or change in practice that I think has been very healthy for this cause, this particular gap. I think opening up conversations with local school districts, as we were able to do at UBC, districts who are hosting French Practica, opening conversations about language proficiency being a dynamic level and set of goals that needed ongoing support rather than a destination or an arrival point that remains somehow static. So I think those conversations, and I see that reflected in the report, that where there are successes in the area of retention, there are also contexts in which language development is being seen as a necessary component of professionalism. And I think on a personal level, for me, finally achieving some sense of authenticity as a French speaker, overcoming deep-seated fears throughout my career, you know, the imposter syndrome that many of us who are supposedly non-Francophones feel. I think opening up and claiming the term Francophone as a more inclusive, excuse me, identity, rather than being born into French speaking or speaking like a native, that in fact, speaking French in the various ways we do, imperfect that they are, nonetheless, and we can, I think, have a healthy discussion about that term Francophone. But I think that for me personally, feeling some degree of authenticity by the end of my long career, I think was an important achievement. And I think the fact that we're talking about linguistic security and insecurity, even among Francophones, I think is a really healthy development. So what gives me hope is this focus on retention. I also am delighted to see the meta systemic perspectives in this report, that FSL teacher shortages, poor retention records, and ongoing marginalization is actually a systemic problem rather than the fault of individual FSL educators. And I think that's a really healthy development. And that teacher education programs themselves are building in language development as a key component prior to, during, and post partnering with school districts, that just opening up this notion that language must continue to be developed throughout one's career is just such a positive development. So kudos to those of you who worked on this report and are invested in seeing it through. I think that it bodes to a much more positive future for FSL education. So I'm very, very pleased about that. There are some elements that worry me, but I think that to answer your question, Stephanie, I think that's what jumps out to me, and I think what we can seize in our research and in our practice moving forward.
I wonder if this is where the exchange part comes in, because Wendy doesn't know I'm going to ask this.
Oh, great.
So, no, your response to where your thinking has landed related to the development message. I remember you saying that retention and development are very hand in hand. Would you say the same goes for confidence and competence? Like if we take a development stance in the same way, if we use the example that you used with adopting a more development-oriented conceptualization with the DELF and the CEFR and so on, does that, how do you feel like that would work the confidence competence gap as well?
Well, I think they're highly correlated, and we've seen in even just in the just as students come into our program, so they've taken the DELF or DELF, they come into the program, and they may have scored very, very high. They may have very high scores on the 4 measures, but they lack that confidence. They haven't, say, been around Francophones who have lived all their lives in French, and they feel somehow at a disadvantage. So their confidence isn't what it could be, and they just don't put themselves out there. And so what I have seen is that even though they, on paper or on an oral test, can score very well, the way they approach the language, the way they put themselves out there is really lacking. And so until they build confidence, their competence kind of stays off to the sidelines. And I've seen very confident people making mistakes here, there, and everywhere, but they're getting out there and they're using the language. And until they, and as long as they don't get smashed down or put down, I just found my first few months, and Catherine and others and Stephanie, yourself, and Callie, who work in teacher education, what I spent my first couple of months typically in my French methodology courses doing was building up confidence, was first of all undoing the damage of that entry exam, because it used to be such a demoralizing experience being categorized. People who were coming into immersion but actually were only qualified according to the test to be in core French. So this just terrible disappointment of being labeled, and then working with native-born, I'll just use that term, Francophones, and feeling less than, and just all of those sort of emotional, self-judging elements that really played against confidence. I felt I had to really build that up. And that's where I found the portfolio was so helpful, to really look at a range of competencies, and to recognize that even those who spent their lives in French, in fact, had areas where they didn't feel as confident. So anyway, it's a long-winded answer to say I think they're highly related, and that you can do a lot on the confidence side to actually impact one's competence.
Yeah, and I think that we were in preparation for this, we sort of talked about that as a possible focus of researchers, to look at how any kind of development train, c'est pas le bon mot, mais an orientation could be shifted. That orientation could shift to development when we look at competence as not only being what you can do, but also your confidence level in regards to what you can do, and how that's perceived, and how that's accepted, particularly in the discipline of teaching.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. When and I think that one quote really in the study really makes it clear, and we talked about that a bit, this idea of being well cooked, being all ready, you're good to go. And if we take that development orientation, I don't know if you have comments on that, just where that takes it. If we decide not to ascribe to we're all done, you're all prepared, off you go, what does that look like? And I see somebody with their hand up. We're gonna pause in a minute for questions, so we'll come back. Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Would love to answer your question. Yes, well, I think as modelers of language learning, if we are modeling for our students, the fact that we make ourselves vulnerable, or say, I feel really good about the way I read in French, but I wish I was more spontaneous in my oral interactions, whatever it might be, the areas that we're always working on. Or I used to be really good at this, but I've noticed lately I'm out of practice with X. I think if we want to model what it is to be a language learner, we have to adopt a developmental stance. And I think the more that the systems in which we work adopt that same stance, so the hiring committees and the mentoring groups that there may be in a district, and I'm using the term district, that's what we use in the West, if board is the term that Ontario uses. So if the board stance is developmental, so that the professional development has always a wing in it that is focused on linguistic development, that it shifts, it normalizes the fact that we are all on a continuum of language proficiency. So you know, those were the parts of the report that I found so hopeful, that in fact those stances are shifting, and it behooves boards to be more open to the notion of continual language development, because they are the ones grappling with these terrible shortages. And I think it would perhaps open up some of the channels that have here to this point been closed when French teachers leave the French teaching stream. You know, invitations to come back into the French teaching stream once you've left might be more, you know, yield better results if in fact this notion of not having to be fully baked was more, I think, prevalent.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of just that leading into the next question and the overarching question that we're going to put in the chat, Marie. So I hope if you're able to just park your question for a couple more minutes. We wanted to ask before getting to this idea of what questions should researchers be asking or focusing on. That's going to be the sort of springboard to the big large group discussion. But what do you feel then, given your reaction to the report and your thinking? I guess, Micah, you can post the next question. What do you feel is in the way? Qu'est-ce qui fait obstacle? Où devons-nous pousser? Ou bien, quelle sorte d'obstacle est-ce qu'il faut surmonter? You can respond in the language of your choice.
I'm just going to stick with English for a sec here, because the notion of marginalization, I find that very distressing to hear that the siloing and marginalization. I mean, we've, you know, Sharon and Callie and others who've researched this forever, Stephanie, you know, I think back to Elizabeth Richards' 2002 report about marginalization, Scott Kissel, Sharon, your work with Alina and Larry Vandergrift in 2006, and with Callie and Stephanie also in 2006. These all highlighted marginalization and the lack of valuing of French teachers. You know, it was heartbreaking to read about it then. It still breaks my heart to read about it now. And the fact that 56% in this survey of early career teachers still considering leaving the profession. This to me is an area, I mean, we have to find out more about why this is still happening. This should be a grave concern to school boards concerned about retention. You know, why is it that secondary teachers feel this more acutely than elementary? I was pleased to see that elementary FSL teachers feel more of a sense of community, which makes sense if we think of the nature of how they teach, you know, that they teach all subjects or more subjects than just their French specialty. But to me, that's, you know, from a mental health perspective, from an inclusion perspective, which is something we say we care about more, this should not be, these numbers are far too high to be considered acceptable. So to me, you know, development versus deficit might be part of that, but I think the valuing of their role, both from their own perspective, I think you know, that notion of confidence may creep in there, but often it's in relation to external valuing. So I think that's still a very big area that needs to be looked at. So how can we build community as FSL teachers within our school and board communities? I think that's something that the system needs to look at, building community and making everyone feel included, whatever their teaching role might be. So those are two areas.
Yeah, and maybe even building community, how, as you mentioned, there's a lot of hope in the report. And I think there are places, perhaps I would suspect many of you here in this meeting know of things that are going on, but they might not be as represented or shared in the research. So it's that as a researcher, you get into the conundrum to say, I'm going to go discover what's going on. And it's like, oh, there's lovely little pockets. And so I think as a researcher, I've become very aware of the idea that I can't assume that nothing's happening, but maybe it's a matter of shining light on it. And then looking at it through different lenses, like we were just talking about. I don't know if even just the use of the framework and so on. because it keeps coming back. We keep hearing that. Okay, no testing, fine, we'll do the framework. But what exactly does that look like in different spheres? Just as an example, I don't know what you think of that, Wendy.
Well, highlighting stories and promising practices is always a good way. I mean, leading through inspiration, I think, is a great motivator. And there are always some wonderful stories. There is always light that can be found. So I think telling those stories, and that's something that CASLT does very, very well. I think it's something Canadian Parents for French has also done well. You know, where are they now? These short clips that tell hopeful stories can be very inspiring.
Mm-hmm. And if I may share, in my practice this year, I've been talking a lot with in-service teachers and shared the notion of the avalanche with them, and they shared it with them. They already know all about it.
Yeah.
It was very interesting, their happy medium take on it, in the sense of, I'm going to be talking to future teachers. I'm not going to tell them it doesn't exist, but I'm also going to tell them that it's not insurmountable.
Yeah.
So it was, it's a very interesting, and maybe that's just to segue to our final sort of piece. Where do you think we need to push? I mean, you mentioned marginalization, that could be in the way, or is that simultaneously where we need to push? Or what's your reaction to those sort of prompts, given all of your experience?
Yeah, I think definitely that ways to build community. I think that just the messaging, continuing the messaging that linguistic development is a part of being a professional, and that it's not a failing, and it's as one would expect one would expect in any discipline that there are multiple components to staying current, to being the best practitioner that you can be, and that extends to beyond the pedagogies, but also to sociocultural practices, inclusion, diversity, decolonization, all of the meta aspects to teaching that we need to integrate. And linguistic development is also part of that, and linguistic diversity, and exploring, you know, elements, cultural elements in relation to the languages that we teach. All of these are, it's, you know, it can't just be one size does not fit all. And I think that as much as possible, if the systems in which we work can recognize that, the better it will be for those, and the better for retention. I just, retention is such an important concept. And I'm so pleased that many boards are starting to really take it seriously.
Okay, great.
We need to help them to continue to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a fairly, I don't want to say simple, but awareness raising around that being a poignant word when we use recruitment and retention. Let's see what we're talking about when we're talking about both.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. We had thought that this would be a good time to pause. I think, Micah, you've been keeping an eye in the chat to sort of first attend to some questions posted in the chat. I have Marie's name down. I'm going to go to them first for sure. But also I want to start orienting everybody to the question that Micah just brought up in the chat there, this idea of research, because that is a research exchange. So we want to, one of the goals of our hour together is to start thinking about what questions should researchers be asking. Everybody here is a researcher in our minds. Those who are teaching, those in school boards, research is about proposing questions and seeing what comes of them when you collect any kind of data in your particular context. So don't feel that you're not a researcher in this context. Mais Mike, est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans le chat qu'on peut aborder entre-temps pour Wendy?
En fait, il y a une belle description d'une initiative, mais il n'y a pas de questions, donc je vais...
on peut donner la parole à Marie, si on veut. She waited so lovely, but you have to open your mic, Marie. Voilà. Thank you.
En ce qui concerne les questions, enfin, je pense que je vais parler anglais parce que many people here like to communicate in both languages. I think a major issue is looking at teachers' self-efficacy. That is research that needs to be undertaken, because many studies have shown that teachers who quit do it because they lack the sense of self-efficacy. And I'm trying to develop that in my teacher preparation courses, because they're unsure of their French. Actually, Wendy, I'm sorry I came late. I had trouble connecting for some reason. Wendy, I really appreciated the way you went over all the complexities and we can't stop mentioning complexities. It certainly is not easy for our students, nor for us. Actually, my question would be too, the valuing of professors who teach the curriculum courses for the French students. Are we at par with other colleagues? I mean, there's a sense there that I found a bit disturbing. However, one of my master's students actually did a study on that, and self-efficacy was the #1 reason why French teachers quit in different countries in the world. And then I'm thinking of Wendy's mention of the DELF. Actually, what level DELF are you expecting them to be achieving?
It depends on the specialization. So if it's elementary immersion, it would be B2. If it's secondary, it would be C1.
Okay.
It's probably different in different universities, and or it may be different in different universities. Perhaps if there are others who can speak to that, I don't want to just be the only voice.
We don't expect, we no longer have a placement test. We used to, but when I was on sabbatical, they voted against it. And of course, I didn't have a voice there. But I do ask them when they come in what their levels are, and they're all over the map. So you're right. So I do try.
Marie, you bring up an excellent point. And again, I'm just going on my own knowledge of the research. I feel like this is an area that would do really well with some focused work on what's happening in cases where one of the deficit-oriented aspects was the over-testing. I mean, they get tested upon entry, they get tested when hiring. If they're applying to 2 or 3 different boards, they have to go through 2 or 3 tests. So it would be interesting to take that up in addition to the self-efficacy piece.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
We don't test them anymore. And I just ask them what their level is for the DELF. They don't all have taken that exam, but they usually tell me, and I can tell pretty well where they're at. And well, I'm also a native speaker of French, so I'm a teacher of French, and I was at the French department before I went to education at Queen's. So I also teach them the language as well as the aspects that they need to know. And it's a very complex issue. And we don't get the recognition we deserve, I think. Anyway, I have other things to say, but you're doing a great job. So I'll let you go.
Thank you, Marie. No, that's excellent. Wendy, go ahead, Micah.
Yeah, I do want to, it's a great jumping off point to actually what Roseanne posted about this initiative, to really bring in what many of us have, a course or some kind of professional development during the program itself to really support teacher candidates with their language development. And in your case, you had a critique or some concerns about whether this overlap with the task that is given to language teachers in the French department. I think that speaks to a really, really important aspect. This idea that those of us in FSL are in the know, and those of us not in FSL are not in the know. And so I think, Wendy, you spoke to that too, this idea of, and this is what you do, the discussion brief that you just put out for Canadian Parents for French on how we can think about, the Indigenous Languages Act now, where is Indigenous language revitalization within all of our language programs. This idea that we need to continue to learn and educate and in order to explain to people what it is that we do, what our needs are, what the issues are. And I know that at UBC we were so fortunate to have an associate dean of teacher education who was in FSL. And so I wondered to what extent that happens at the district level too, the fact that we're trying to mobilize our colleagues who are not in FSL, the dean or the finance person or the admissions person, and we sit down and we spend those hours to explain what we're trying to do in FSL education. So I think that's a really important point that Roseanne raised there. I'm seeing a few more. I want to go to Dominique, who's had the hand up for a while now. It's still.
Oh, I haven't seen,
my
again, my
screen.
phone. I only see, I'm trying to scroll and see everybody.
So,
Go ahead.
Dominique, c'est à vous. Et ensuite, on va passer à Daniel et oui, et d'autres. OK.
Oui, il nous
Merci.
reste 15 minutes.
Merci
Okay.
beaucoup. I'd like to actually answer your question, Mika, what kind of questions researchers should be asking. And I have partnered with some school boards, the Ottawa District School Board and the Blue Water. But what I find very interesting is that a team of consultants developed a continuum to figure out the reflexive piece from instructors on what tools they think would be useful for them in terms of linguistic development or linguistic diversity or linguistic proficiency. So the question is, what if we were to actually collect data on there are existing resources and we know that they are not using them to their full potential. So there is a gap between what exists and what maybe those instructors who are capable of reflexive on their needs could maybe tell us on what is the gap between what exists and what's their needs. So I think I would be interested in working on this, particularly with the 4 school boards that I am working, and they are going to be looking at resources for linguistic proficiency and collecting already the data on the one that is offered to them and why they think that, because we need to know why they're not using them and what stops them, what are the challenges, and maybe help them transform those tools and resources so that they make sense to them. But for me, it's like the making sense of, which I think is maybe missing. So that's a research question that I am very interested in exploring.
Thank you. I think we definitely saw some of that disconnecting across our data because we focused on the 3 different participant groups: teachers, districts, and teacher educators. And yeah, sometimes there are things put in place, but they're not taken up. And so there seems to be a lack of communication there across the groups with regard to what's needed or maybe how it's offered. So that's a very good point.
Wendy, did you have anything else to add to that? I just want to keep our featured speaker in the mix.
Well, oh, thanks. I just love hearing, Dominique, that notion of, then if the resource needs to be tailored in some way, often we have this kind of on-off approach to interventions. And, if it doesn't immediately land the way we intend, we abandon it and move to something else. Sometimes it is, maybe it just needs to go online, or maybe the timing needs to change. But let's find out. Let's find out why it didn't quite make. What aspect was it? Was it the whole intervention, or was there just some small part of it? And with so much available to us now online, community building. I do a community of practice for mental health literacy in BC with people I've never met all around the province. I mean, I'm sure this is true for all of us now. And it actually works. It actually has some meaning for us in terms of outreach and feeling supported. It would be nicer to meet in person from time to time, but there are lots of ways that we can do things that we didn't used to do them. So yeah, that notion of tailoring our resources and our outreach efforts, I think really has to be, we have to go at it a few different angles before we declare it a lack of success.
Or maybe giving them agency so that we can reflect on how we can support that, but giving them agency so that they tell us.
And that ties into, I think, what Marie was saying about self-efficacy. I think that's there's some similarities there.
I think it also ties into one of the of the report, which talks about this idea that it's at the system level, it might not just be an individual thing. Five aren't that there are system level barriers or things in the way. And also this idea that Micah was mentioning that lots of people might think it's a great idea, and then we try it out and then we say, well, why aren't they doing what we thought would be good for them? And as you say, asking them, but also getting a sense of, why is it something that's maybe my limit on what I can do? And so that fifth gap really talks about this idea of not pointing fingers and kind of getting a sense of what barriers are up for everybody and what possibilities are possible for everybody, so that we can come to some sort of agreement. I really like that, Dominique. And it ties into the third gap of the project that we'll be talking about later. So hopefully you'll be able to come to that and expand a little bit on the resources piece as well. Merci. Go ahead. Sorry, Micah. This is how this exchanges are all over the place. Did you want to go with what you see? I don't know. There was a hand up. Somebody else had their hand up after Dominique, si je me rappelle bien.
I only see comments in the chat that we're following. Laura has a question. I think Marie maybe wanted to come back to something we were talking about. So maybe Laura and then Marie.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde.
Salut.
Merci beaucoup de donner cette belle discussion. Là, c'est vraiment intéressant. Je n'ai pas lu tout le rapport récemment, donc peut-être que vous avez donné la réponse déjà dans le rapport. Vous permettez, si je parle en français, c'est juste que je vais peut-être exprimer plus clairement mes idées. En fait, il y a deux choses qui me sont venues en tête. Au-delà de l'insécurité linguistique que peuvent éprouver les enseignants, c'est une chose que j'ai vue beaucoup quand, pendant 6 ans, je coordonnais le programme d'été pour les enseignants et enseignantes. Et ça, c'était quelque chose qui était plus évident pour certains enseignants qui pourtant revenaient se ressourcer. Mais dans une autre direction, à partir de vos commentaires, j'avais 2 idées qui me sont venues. Je ne sais pas si elles sont explorées. Une, c'est quel est le support que les enseignants reçoivent par les directeurs de des conseils scolaires. Ayant travaillé dans une école où j'étais enseignante de français langue seconde, 3e, 4e année au tout début de ma carrière, j'ai énormément apprécié le fait que la directrice de l'école était en faveur de nos activités. Elle nous appuyait. On ressentait un soutien au niveau administratif. Donc, pour moi, ça, c'est une question qui se pose, que ce soit au niveau de l'élémentaire ou au niveau du secondaire. Quel est le support que la direction propose et quels moyens de reconnaissance elle va utiliser pour les enseignants et enseignantes? Parce que si on est toujours inaperçu et qu'on est les derniers dans les portatives, on ne ressentira jamais ce sentiment de valeur. Ça, c'était la première question. La deuxième était, pourquoi est-ce que vous avez pensé au parallèle qu'il y a entre le manque d'enseignants et le manque de rétention des enseignants ici au Canada, mais c'est en train de se passer partout ailleurs dans le monde. Est-ce qu'il y a des études parallèles qui disent, c'est pas seulement de l'insécurité linguistique, il y a peut-être autre chose. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a de commun dans le fait qu'on manque si cruellement d'enseignants de français langue seconde? Ça, c'est mes 2 petites questions. Je vais devoir vous quitter dans 5 minutes, malheureusement. J'ai une autre réunion, mais bon, merci beaucoup d'enregistrer cette réunion. Puis, merci, voilà, c'est tout.
Non, merci, Laura. Je veux donner la parole à Wendy, même en français et en anglais, just so you were nodding, mais moi, je peux parler à Laura n'importe quand.
Oui.
Et on va se parler, Laura, c'est sûr.
Je peux juste dire, peut-être on peut laisser la question de recherche pour la dernière portion d'aujourd'hui, mais quant au soutien donné par la direction, je suis d'accord que c'est critique. Ça peut tout changer pour un groupe d'enseignants, pour un enseignant individuellement. Si la direction comprend les défis, comprend les questions et soutient ses profs, ça peut créer, ça change la culture dans une école. Et ça peut être tout simplement d'écouter, d'engager avec l'enseignant, de visiter la classe, de voir ce qui se passe, de donner quelques petits fonds pour de la nourriture pour une petite rencontre après l'école. Ce sont de petits messages, des petites actions qui peuvent faire toute la différence. Et je pense que dans le rapport, ils ont dit que les écoles qui valorisent leurs profs, qui démontrent cette valorisation, ont des meilleurs taux de rétention. Alors, je pense que ça, c'est assez bien compris. Stéphanie, tu peux me dire s'il y a d'autres aspects du rapport qui parlent de ce soutien donné par la direction. Mais il me semble que fournir une culture où ce que les profs enseignent, ce qu'ils vivent dans leur vie professionnelle, ça, c'est déjà, ça donne beaucoup à améliorer les conditions de travail pour les profs de FLS.
Je ne sais pas si Micah va mentionner, elle a le micro ouvert, juste la divergence entre le rôle du mentorat selon la direction et selon les enseignants. Alors, je vais juste laisser ça à côté, mais juste pour dire qu'il y avait un ton dans le rapport parmi les participants de cette idée que juste exactement ce que Wendy a décrit, ce qui est formidable, c'est excellent, mais c'est comme les enseignants de français langue seconde doivent être contents avec juste cela. Parce qu'il y a la marginalisation qui existe. Il y avait un ton que même avec le soutien, même avec cela, on reste ici. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire au-delà de ça pour vraiment, d'une grande manière, valoriser le français, valoriser mes compétences? Il y avait juste ce questionnement qui existait parmi les participants. Je voulais juste mentionner ça parce que c'est extrêmement important. Et les directeurs, directrices, l'administration, les conseils scolaires, les participants ont mentionné cela comme leurs approches ou bien ce qui est leur stratégie. Mais il y avait de la part des enseignants la réponse comme OK, c'est bon et on a des problèmes pour y accéder. Et est-ce qu'il y a tant d'autres choses? Alors, c'est juste un petit ajout avec cela. Je ne sais pas, Wendy, est-ce que tu as quelque chose à ajouter avant que Micah... Je prévois la réponse de Micah.
Vas-y, Micah.
C'est pas juste.
Non, je veux juste en fait revenir sur quelques des messages dans le chat si je peux. I mean, I think what we're seeing here is, you know, used to be structures imposed. This is how your teacher education program goes. And I think what we're seeing is this idea of that we need to look at the agency of our teacher candidates. So as Leo James said, we encourage teacher candidates to do a needs assessment so they can set goals and work towards achieving the goals. Callie noted, as we provide optional opportunities to support teacher candidates, we've been wondering how to support them to take the risks to access those opportunities. So there's a lot of thinking around, you know, digging deeper into what is being offered. I think this came up earlier, and how is it taken up, or why not, and what is it that we need to tweak, as you said, Wendy. So I think it's a real balancing act between mobilizing the larger, the meta structures, the administration, but then also coming back to the teachers and allowing them to have a voice is what I'm seeing here.
If I can just mention, that was the point I was making about the mentorship, that in the research report, it does show that a lot of formal is being offered, and it's not necessarily always being taken up, but informal mentorship on the ground. So we really distinguish between that and saying to folks to be aware of what mentorship is happening that might not be in line with what you are presuming through your formalized offering might be something that they need. So I like the needs analysis piece at that ballpark.
Exactly. And I think it comes back to this idea that, you know, there are structures in place, there are funding mechanisms in place, and these are simply being taken up as they always have been, and these things are provided. But is that really what the teachers and the teacher candidates are asking for? It's these informal supports that are really closely correlated to well-being, to addressing the avalanche, the onslaught of all the issues that comes, those little micro elements that turn into this big, large, heavy cloud, you know, that can sit there. So
I'm cognizant of time, and I know we wanted to give. I want to honor what's happening in the chat because again, I can't see with my phone, but I do want to. We wanted to invite Wendy to sort of offer a final response, given what we've all come in with, what we've heard, questions we might be asking now. But Wendy, do you have any?
Well, I am really keen
transition.
to hear, particularly as we have some talented researchers, all of you are talented researchers on whatever micro or macro level you operate. I would love to finish with questions. I think that questioning approach, which you've taken in the report, is such a uplifting way. I'd like to find out why FSL teachers, if you can get to them, do leave their roles. So if someone could really do an in-depth qualitative study of those that we know, I know it's harder to do in Ontario, but it's really easy to do in other parts of Canada. You just jump out of the FSL stream and go into the English stream. It's really easy. Why have they done that? What would motivate them to return to the French stream? I don't think we'd have near the shortage that we do if currently qualified French teachers were actually teaching French. So that's always been a question for me. What's another one? And I'm really fascinated by how non-native French speakers are claiming the identity of Francophone. I think as much as possible, if we can problematize that identity marker and be more inclusive in what it means, I think that confidence piece would also be revealed. So I'm really keen to hear some more questions. I think that would be a great way to end today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, we have about 2 or 3 more minutes if people want to put questions into the chat that you're left with in terms of what researchers should be asking you as researchers and also those who.
Well, that's a lovely quote, Leo James. As we work to create light for others, we naturally light our own way. Thank you for including.
Yeah, I love
you can always
that.
count
That's
on Leo
lovely.
James for a lovely literary inspiration. Dominique, avez une question?
Yes, because you are talking about the I'm just bouncing back on what Laura said. It is happening not only in Canada, but it's happening everywhere. And I think this is and partnering with other countries where they are facing. So I'm thinking like some countries in Africa, like we already have research partnership for France. And working with those instructors and doing comparative analysis of, I'm sure there is something specific about Canada, but there might be some elements which are converging as well. So that would be very interesting. We all have already do. So I'm sure you all know about COIL, like all of these kind of partnering classes with other classes. And sometimes I'm doing one right now, one with Cameroon and one with Marseille, which has a high migration, to compare plurilingualism and integrating the language of the instructors, like the multilingual aspect of the instructors, and maybe by looking at similar environments. I was comparing Toronto with Marseille, where there is like high plurilingual and multicultural children in classroom, and the instructors teaching French or teaching Spanish or teaching another language are facing the same obstacle that we are in Canada. So I like that idea of it as well, and expanding and comparative studies is always interesting.
Yeah, I think it builds community in that very interesting way. And I think there's actually work happening a lot that I'm aware of, inquiries into exactly what Laura was asking for special issues of journals. And then obviously there's a conference happening in the next few weeks in Brazil that's kind of looking at la francophonie autour du monde, and the shortage is definitely part of a theme that's internal to that.
And we're all using the same framework, the CEFR.
Oui, exactement.
So that's really like the common element.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's you kind of go back and forth. It's the common, and then we come back to but our context, and it's the discussion. I think that's very important. I see Danielle posting about the funding, and I think that was it. I'm very with. That's something that we talked about at the CASLT AGM, and I think that's getting some traction, which is lovely. This idea of discussion: how are they allocated, and how can they be allocated in a way where they make it all the way down to the folks who would benefit from them, and in what cases in different areas of Canada are they making it down, and what does that look like when funding does at quote unquote what it's used for, and what how it's received in different ways. So that would be a definite interesting research question.
I think it's so important just to build on what Dominique was saying. You know, we talk about French, but we need to talk about all the languages, all our linguistic resources, and how those are tied to our various identities. And I think there's something about language, there's something there that excludes but can also include. And I think those are some of the issues and the questions that we really need to delve into. I think we haven't explored those yet, maybe to the extent that we could. And I know, you know, Stephen, I know that's something that you're looking at as well. You see you're nodding. So I think there are a lot of questions, and I always think that, you know, there's so many questions we need to be asking, we need to be looking at. And there sometimes it feels like there's not enough. There's just not enough.
No, but I mean, if I can use that as a springboard to sort of start wrapping up, I think that was the whole point. It might be the very frustrating part where we come to something like this and all we do is ask questions. And we're like, bye. But it's mainly, c'est ça, c'est pour pousser les pensées, pousser les réflexions. I'm cognizant of time. I value your time very greatly. So I want to make sure to thank Wendy Carr, our featured speaker, pour son énergie, ses commentaires.
Yeah, and I'm sure that we'll be continuing coming back to some of the questions that Wendy, that you raised, some of the issues that we talked about today. So thank you so much pour aujourd'hui d'être là avec nous, de penser, de réfléchir, de repenser peut-être quelques idées, quelques questions. Et je vais en fait dire à la prochaine. And I want to say a gros merci to Wendy for taking the time to join us today. Yeah, à la prochaine is how I'd like to leave it. Merci beaucoup.